So, bladder cancer and immunotherapy is something that, again, makes us all really excited about the developments, the evolution, and the opportunity for improved survival for these patients. My disclosure is I am a PI of an investigator-initiated trial using avelumab for surgically resectable bladder cancer, and Pfizer is supporting this study, as well as the Baylor College of Medicine Cancer Center. So if we look at the very other end of the spectrum from non-muscle invasive disease, advanced urothelial cancer is a killer. It is the 9th most common cancer worldwide of the bladder, and 160,000 worldwide deaths annually. It is the 8th most common cause of cancer deaths in U.S. men. It doesn't make the top 10 in U.S. women because of gynecologic and breast malignancies. But in the U.S., estimated in 2017, almost 17,000 deaths from bladder cancer. And these, of course, are advanced bladder cancer that progresses and becomes kind of consuming. The prognosis with first-line combination chemotherapy using platinum-based regimens is only 14 to 15 months with advanced metastatic bladder cancer. And if a patient's disease fails platinum combination, then the prognosis with second-line salvage therapy, which we know will not be very successful, is about 6 months. So PD-1 and PD-L1, what are they and what do they do? PD-1 is this protein called programmed death 1. It is a receptor expressed primarily here on the activated T cells. When it's bound, this T cell won't work. PD-L1 is its ligand on antigen-presenting cells. The ligand is the checkpoint, and so in tumor cells in the tumor microenvironment, it's supposed to be running around and trying to mark out cancer. But when PD-1 is bound to PD-L1, there is a downregulation of T cell function, and the cancer can evade immune surveillance. Normally, this T cell is going around looking for non-like cells, and when the ligand is bound to the receptor, that cancer cell is hiding from the body's immune system. So blockade using these drugs breaks that link and allows the T cell to now find the cancer better. This blockade has been shown to improve overall survival in many solid tumors, and bladder cancer luckily is also in that list. The first checkpoint trials in advanced urothelial cancer came in Pembrolizumab and atezolizumab in 2015, reported at the national meeting of ASCO. And if we look, these patients are our sort of index patient for advanced bladder cancer, median age 70, median age 66. The Pembrolizumab trial only included those that did have some staining for PD-1 and PD-L1 in the tumor tissue. The atezolizumab trial did eventually include non-positive staining patients as well, but still the majority of patients, over 50%, had some evidence of PD-L1 in their tumors. These patients had all had significant pretreatment with other drugs, and at least in the atezolizumab trial, they did include those patients that we know who have renal insufficiency, have a GFR under 60. They cannot get cisplatin in the first place. This was the atezolizumab response, and this is the waterfall plot looking at those based on their staining. So IC3 meant that they had a significant amount of PD-L1 staining in their tumor. IC0 meant they had no staining of PD-L1 in the tumor. And in those that respond, here's looking at RECIST criteria, usually measuring disease on a CT scan or MRI. But you can see these red bars, there's at least 2 patients who had 0 staining for PD-L1 who had measurable response to atezolizumab. And then you see that certainly they're more concentrated here in non-responding patients. But ultimately, you were able to see a really good signal for this drug in these patients with advanced bladder cancer. These initial findings showed that checkpoint inhibition was safe and tolerable. It was better tolerated than the normal chemotherapy drugs that these patients are offered, and it showed activity in a heavily pretreated population that has advanced disease. The response did include those patients who did not have high levels of PD-L1 expression. So one of the drugs on market only is approved for patients who have tissue staining for the protein in their tumor tissue, but we may be missing the opportunity to treat some patients if that's the criteria that we have to go on. So we went from these earlier trials to phase 2 trials and phase 3 randomized trials. The oncologist was allowed to use their choice of chemo as an alternative second line or first line. And this just summarizes some of the names you might hear. IMVIGOR was looking at atezolizumab in several different cohorts. Checkmate is using nivolumab. Keynote is always Merck's trials looking at pembrolizumab. Avelumab, there's also been phase 1 and durvalumab phase 1 and 2 looking in advanced urothelial cancer. Most of these studies are second line, so the patient already got cisplatin and gemcitabine or IMVAC and has progression, and then they go on to second line therapy. But it was a good idea and appropriate for this patient population to look at those who are cisplatin-ineligible first line treatment. So using these drugs that have shown some evidence as a salvage therapy and coming to the patient who's not eligible for cisplatin because of renal dysfunction, hearing dysfunction, performance status, some of the other reasons that we would not like to give cisplatin to a patient with advanced cancer. So atezolizumab did this in their cohort 1 of the IMVIGOR trial. They had many patients with CKD and a good number of patients with lower performance status. Most of the time, ECOG-2 does not enroll in clinical trials. So it's really great to see these clinical trials getting opened up, to more of the patients that are real life with bladder cancer. Keynote, pembrolizumab had 43% with CKD and 45% with ECOG-2 at the time of enrollment. And this was what Dr. Rosenberg presented in the Lancet, looking at the response rates. And the red shows progression of disease, blue shows disease staying stable, and then green shows partial to complete response. And it's notable to see that in the high staining groups, those patients that had evidence of PD-L1 in their tumors, you are seeing a lot more response, a lot more green, and the dark green, complete response, complete resolution of any measurable disease on their scans. But even in the IC0, those patients that had no protein staining in their tumors are still able to have some partial response and even complete response. But ultimately, better reduction in tumor burden as measured by imaging with higher PD-L1 expression. This update presented at ASCO a few months ago reported on those who were first line ineligible for cisplatin and also second line after cisplatin-based therapy. They had more patients in that group, certainly. But in the first cohort, first line cisplatin ineligible, their overall response rate was 24%. Complete response rate is 8%. Pretty remarkable for metastatic bladder cancer or urothelial cancer. The median duration of response was not reached out to 29 months, so there are many patients still on treatment. And 2-year overall survival is 41%. That's a significant improvement from the first slide I showed you that was approximately 1 year. Cohort 2 in the second line therapy still seen really remarkable response rates and complete response of 7%, 2-year overall survival 23% here in second line salvage patients. And so ultimately, at least in atezolizumab, we are seeing durable and tolerable treatments for advanced disease. Keynote, this randomized trial, phase 3 using pembrolizumab, was all second-line patients after previous platinum-based chemo. They now have updated follow-up out to greater than 2 years. Overall response rate with the chemo drugs, this was sort of dealer's choice of salvage chemo, only 11%. When the patients given pembrolizumab, the overall response rate, 21%. And you're seeing just a 7.3-month median survival with the chemo arm and a 10-month median survival with pembrolizumab. Response duration was only 4 months with the chemo arm and not reached here in the pembrolizumab. And this is showing just the difference kind of incrementally from the chemo arm to the pembrolizumab arm, 50% median survival here. In cisplatin-ineligible patients, patients who are coming first-line treatment with pembrolizumab, showing that these are older patients. 10% of patients enrolled in this study were over 85 years old. They had 42% poorer performance status, relatively speaking, and they had an overall response rate of almost 30%. 8% of these were complete response, and about 20% of these were partial response. And the response rate was as high as 50% when there is that positive staining in the tumor before treatment. The response duration, which is remarkable, showing that 82% of patients are on treatment with sustained response at 6 months. And, well, I'm sorry, I should say, of those who respond, 82% are staying on therapy at 6 months because of continued response, and 68% able to stay on therapy at greater than 12 months, as long as there was an initial response indicated. So this is something to kind of come back to and reference, not something I'm going to go through in detail, but looking at the trials that have been reported in salvage second-line therapies here in the top 5, and then cisplatin-ineligible therapies, cisplatin-ineligible patients, you're seeing good accrual numbers and really comparable response rates between the different drugs. Cisplatin-ineligible, because they're first-line treatments, we would expect them to maybe have an incrementally higher overall response rate. But seeing a complete response that has been durable and sustained somewhere in 5 to 8% gives us a lot of hope and optimism. And the other thing to note is that these patients have lower rates of adverse events. You're seeing patients having greater than grade 3 adverse events, only 16%, 15%, less than 10%. And those compare relative to cisplatin-based therapy, much higher rates of adverse events and coming off of therapy because of toxicity. It's important, though, to point out that these are new drugs working in a very different way from cytotoxic chemotherapy. The treatment-related toxicities are what you might expect for any cancer-targeted therapy, mainly fatigue, nausea, pruritus, arthralgias, fever, diarrhea, and the rates range from 5 to about 20% having grade 3 adverse events. But more importantly, and this is something we all need to start becoming familiar with, are the immune-related toxicities. These are drugs that are turning on a patient's immune system, and that's having unusual, unexpected, and kind of unprecedented side effects in systems that we're not used to asking the patient about. Now, as urologists, we're often not evaluating these side effects, but your patient may be coming back to the ER on drug after cystectomy, or you're hearing about the patient, and they can have some really unusual, think of them sort of autoimmune type reactions that can be sustained and can be hard to manage. Pneumonitis, elevated liver enzymes, kind of hard to manage rash. The rates of grade 3 or greater were about 10% in atezolizumab, and importantly, maybe even a quarter of patients had to get steroids to manage these AEs. So it's a little bit of a different game, trying to be aware of these possible toxicities. But overall, relatively to chemotherapy, these drugs are much better tolerated, and the patients are able to stay on therapy. Chemotherapy, we know we give maybe 6 cycles and then give the patient a holiday. And for patients who are responding to these drugs, they're left on them as long as they can tolerate. And you're seeing patients going 2 years and longer, because we're now starting to get to that time point since they've been approved and available. Overall, multiple checkpoint inhibitors have been approved in the last 3 years. It's really an amazing time. Multiple of these are FDA approved, sometimes in a rapid kind of approval process through the FDA. So first approved was atezolizumab in 2016, and then we had all of these approved in 2017. And now it's a kind of large playing field, trying to look at what other patient statuses we can use these drugs in. So urologists are now much more involved in interventional trials than we ever were before, in bladder cancer at least, for development and trial design, backing up even to non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, muscle invasive bladder cancer that could go on to cystectomy, and of course metastatic disease. So In metastatic disease, some of the things that are being tested, adding a checkpoint inhibitor to chemotherapy. So in a patient who may have had a progression on first-line therapy, then going to second-line docetaxel or gemcitabine plus pembrolizumab. And so this was reported, at least initially, this year at ASCO. Also, maybe combining a checkpoint inhibitor with a targeted therapy. These are sort of designs that are in process being studied. We could back it up, and people are looking at the neoadjuvant space. We don't really know how long to give, how much to give, what effect to expect, but there are multiple trials ongoing in the US and the UK and also across Europe. What about BCG unresponsive? I talked this earlier today about some of those trials that are available as well for patients who have progression or recurrence on BCG. And who may be unfit or unwilling for cystectomy. There are several reports this year of some of the early European trials. A large enough Italian study using pembrolizumab had 43 patients, all resectable disease, single-arm phase 2. They gave them 3 cycles prior to cystectomy, and they showed that in their first 25 evaluable patients, they had a 32% PT0 rate and a 12% of non-invasive disease, ultimately equaling a 44% downstaging less than PT2. They did point out that all of their patients had MRI before starting pembrolizumab and had what was called measurable disease. Now that's all still maybe open to interpretation how that's qualified, because we do know there's a real rate of PT0 with your initial TURBT alone. But in going to a pembrolizumab treatment prior to cystectomy, they definitely saw a treatment effect and a T0 rate effect. There's also another big European study based, I think, starting in the UK as the principal site, but in many countries around Europe. They've enrolled 69 patients so far, and they similarly had a 29% PT0 rate and overall a 39% downstaging rate. Now this, we know from our neoadjuvant cisplatin-based trials that PT0 translates into much more durable prognosis, success with cystectomy. Neoadjuvant trials in the U.S. are all not yet reported and all still starting to enroll. We have one that's open here in Houston at Baylor and at my VA using avelumab prior to cystectomy. Johns Hopkins is running a study using nivolumab plus urelumab, plus minus urelumab. Petros Grivas, based out of University of Washington, is running a multi-site trial with a similar sort of schema. And Memorial Sloan Kettering is also neoadjuvant, studying the addition of pembrolizumab to standard of care gemcitabine and cisplatin. The other interesting space, because we know these patients may not be able to get cystectomy, is how much immunotherapy could help radiation. So SWOG 1806, which is going to be open to all the cooperative groups in I think a month or less, is going to be looking at pragmatic use of chemoradiation plus or minus atezolizumab. And then there's also a trial based out of NYU that's going across multi-centers looking at pembrolizumab plus gemcitabine plus high-dose radiation therapy for non-cystectomy candidates. The trial that we have, as I indicated, is just a pilot study to look at 10 patients in a year who are cisplatin ineligible, but also surgical candidates. Primary endpoints are just immune markers in the tissue, and secondary endpoints looking at PT0 and clinical outcomes. Atezolizumab, we also are opening or in progress of opening for BCG unresponsive disease. In conclusion, we really have seen a historic rate of approval for new drugs active in urothelial cancer in the bladder. These drugs are approved for second-line therapy in metastatic urothelial cancer, and atezolizumab and pembrolizumab are FDA approved as first-line therapy for metastatic bladder cancer who are not eligible for cisplatin. there are a lot of questions, and that's where a lot of these clinical trials come into play. Do we use these as first line? Should we change our standard of care and not give gemcitabine, cisplatin, or IMVAC in all patients? How do we select patients for immunotherapy? The tumor staining has been something that we think can help predict responders, but there are very clear examples of response in patients that did not have staining in their original TURBT specimens. How about in combination, trying to see where this works? And we can learn a lot from other spaces as well, from other malignancies, seeing what other spaces are doing. And it's really cool to see bladder cancer kind of being discussed in the greater scheme of other cancers. And then after a patient progresses, what other options exist? There's a whole kind of grab bag of other options to try to move the patient to another therapy that might work. So thank you for your attention.